We are 1688. Let's see if we can cross 1700. And we have a black game against a 1699. Great. E3. Okay, so E3 is not in and of itself a bad move. The way that I like to respond is by playing D5. Okay, D3. So this is probably going to be a hippo. Okay, knight D2. Yeah, this seems like a reverse hippo. I'm not going to go through, our preferred setup again. I'm just going to play the moves. Those of you who have been watching carefully know that I like a particular arrangement of pieces, which involves not putting the knight on C6, but who can tell me real fast what is the sort of defining characteristic of the setup that I like to adopt against these types of openings? I like to play the move pawn C6. And the point, and we can play it immediately and then put the bishop on D6, or we can start with bishop D6 and then play C6. Okay, or we can castle first. It really doesn't matter. I don't know what white's doing. This isn't even a hippo, but that doesn't change our setup. We're still going to go with our preferred setup. And the point of C6 is to build a pawn chain so that when white fianchettos their bishop, it stares right, it's biting on granite. Okay, so let's castle. Now you might ask, well, what do we do about this knight? And once again, if you've watched carefully, you know that very often this knight goes to D7 and then it swings around via F8 to G6 so as not to block the bishop. Now, in order to get this knight to G6, what additional move might we want to make? And I think we're going to make this move now because it's a very flexible move and we don't know exactly how white's going to develop his kingside. So I think it makes sense to start with the flexible move rook E8, just reinforcing the center. And depending on how white positions his or her pieces, okay, so G4. So this is actually not such a bad setup that our opponent is adopting. It's kind of like a hippo on steroids. And we have to be very careful. If we go knight BD7, we can get our knight trapped. White can go G5 there. So in that sense, rook E8 might have been not the most accurate move. And there's many ways that we can go around that. I'm going to do something a little bit that looks a little bit strange. Rather than developing the knight to D7, we're going to develop it to A6 and then bring it back into the center via C7. We're going to do this, if that makes sense. And then later the knight can go out to E6. Adjust, thank you for the tier 1. Now, what move on the queen side should we make at some point? Let's play it now. Which grabs space. It prevents certain expansion ideas on the queen side. Yeah, so let's throw in A5 just for fun, and also it discourages white from castling queenside, because if white castles queenside now, we drop our knight back to D7. That's why we left this square open. That's why we didn't put the other knight to D7. And we're not worried, and white's not threatening H5. I'm not worried about the quote-unquote attack. With that being said, we shouldn't leave these knights here forever, especially because the bishop is blocked. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to be able to meet knight F3 with bishop G4. So what we're going to do is get our knight to C5, which is a nice central square. We're not afraid of B4 because of knight A4. We're not afraid of D4. That's a really bad move because some genius decided to put their rook on E8. Okay, but this opens up the E file, and this plays right into our hands. Now, we might ask, how can we exploit the E file? Yeah, we have this X-ray going against the queen. Well, one of the best ways to exploit an X-ray is to put a knight on a square that was formerly defended by this pawn. So we have a couple of moves like that. We can go knight B5, but I think an even sexier approach is to go knight 7 E6 and then try to get this knight over to F4, which is the sort of, prime real estate, mansion in Malibu kind of square. Knight F4. Yeah, I'll definitely explain after the game why I'm not worried about the kingside attack. And this usually leads to further tactics. Just putting the knight on F4 in many types of positions, you can almost guarantee yourself that you are going to have some sort of a tactic to follow. And sure enough, if you look very carefully, you identify the undefended pieces, you'll find the move, well, either knight to D3, it doesn't really matter. We can bring this knight to D3. And not only do we win a pawn, but we totally destroy white's queenside pawn cover, and we force the king to move, so we do a lot of good things in one. Okay, now that is total self-destruction, and this is a great example of not playing automatically. Most people here would immediately grab the bishop on B2, but one of the things you have to start doing, as a 1700, thank you, Chess Dojo, for the raid is you just always got to look for a better move, right? You don't want to play automatically unless you're low on time. And just by me saying that, I think most of you already see the possibility of winning the queen with bishop g4. Just by not playing automatically, you're already opening your eyes to a lot of these additional options. And this was a total collapse by white at the end, but it was already bad. Now, I will admit that I probably didn't play ideally in the opening. And if I were playing a classical game, if I were playing a game at my level, I would probably adopt a slightly different setup. I would probably go knight c6 and then bring the pawn to f5 and play sort of an Austrian attack setup. If we think of this as a reverse perk, this is essentially just an Austrian attack setup. But I wanted to be consistent with the setup that I've adopted previously, and so we decided to play the one with bishop d6 and c6. Not that there's anything wrong with this. This is still very solid. Yeah, I have speedrun games on the perk, so you can definitely check that out. Okay, so first interesting moment is here. Again, don't go knight bd7 because of g5. So that's why we found an alternate route for the knight to c7. Now, why was I not afraid? Let's take this moment. Why was I not afraid of the kingside attack? Well, first of all, you can think of it this way. There is a very long delta between... Sorry, that's the wrong word. There's a very wide gap between g5 and 8. Pawns on g5 and h4 don't mean that you're going to get checkmated. I think a lot of players, especially beginners, they think that the moment that somebody plays h4, g4, they're already checkmated. That's it. You can administer the last rites and, you can shovel dirt on yourself. But there's a very, very long time before white actually converts this into anything. And to show you that, let's imagine that black just goes back and forth for a bunch of moves. I'm just going to go knight f8 and knight d7. How does white even get... how does white even convert this into an attack? Well, first of all, white can't go h5. Because that blunders the g-pawn. So white has to defend the g-pawn. Now, theoretically, this would already allow us to get bishop g4 and throwing a monkey wrench into white's whole attacking design, because now e4 is a threat. But for the sake of argument, let's say that black continues to go back and forth. Presumably, you would go h5, right? And then presumably, you would go g6. So, first of all, if we take this position concretely, black can just take on g6. But even if we were to go h6, which is the sort of classical method of dealing with g6, is white anywhere close to even... checkmate is, a word that that doesn't exist here. White is not even close. And the reason white's not close is because white's pieces are not properly arranged in order to... They're not coordinated at all. White doesn't have any good pieces on the king side, and just because the rook is staring at this pawn doesn't mean anything. So I think the key lesson from these kinds of games is that you don't need to be afraid of attacks that quote-unquote attacks that come out of nowhere. An attack has to be set up properly by good piece coordination, the presence of pieces on the side of the board that you're getting attacked in. And, if you're a 17, 1800, you got to start calling people's bluff. This kind of style can't scare you anymore. And sometimes you just got to continue playing as you would normally play and call your opponent's bluff and see that nothing happens. Rather than saying, oh, crap, h4, I'm getting checkmate. And when people panic... What often happens, paradoxically, is I see a lot of people making moves on the king side. Like, you might panic and go g6. This is exactly how you get checkmated. You make a move on the king side. So, for that reason, we just ignore. We go knight c5, and knight c5 has a point. Again, in case of knight f3, we're preparing to play bishop g4. Does that make sense? So, d4 is total self-destruction. Similarly, b4 would allow the knight to worm into a4, which is a terribly nasty square. Yarrow, thank you for the tier 3. White is kind of out of moves here. It's very hard for white to even play a move because of how passive it is. Well, the dark sky, white was nowhere near doubling the rooks in that position. So I don't see a move for white here. And if white castles queenside, which maybe white should have tried. Now, black, on the other hand, has... solid fundamentals. We have a good center. A good center allows us to marshal our forces between the two sides of the board. We have active pieces. And if we play a move like queen e7, we have a target. We can attack the a3 pawn. We can use our pawns. Our attack on the queen side is actually going to be dangerous. it's actually going to be dangerous. We might even move this knight away from c5 in order to open up the battery against the a3 pawn. Then we might push a4 when the moment is right. We might also do something I've done in a previous speedrun game, which is, for example, we can even go a4, and after b4, who can tell me, who can spot a very creative tactical idea? This seems very counterproductive, obvious, and it usually is, but I think in this specific instance, if you know what you're doing on the queen side, provoking b4 can actually be a good thing. Not knight b3. It's way too early to sacrifice the knight, although the correct move prepares a nice sacrifice. But if you're sacking a knight, you better get rid of all of white's queenside pawns. So think about how you can use your minor pieces to break through white's pawn shell. Very good. Knight a6, Frankfurt Airport move. And then you just want to take on b4 and crash through with a3, for example. You're going to have 2 pawns for the piece. The other knight's coming to b5, the queen's dropping into a5. Notice how all of black's pieces are nicely clustered on the right side of the board, literally and figuratively. So this is a cool idea, this a4 and the knight back to be able then to sacrifice on a4. I wonder if I can look for an example of something like that, although I kind of doubt it. No, I found a couple of examples. This is, as you can see, a game of 2 very strong French players. Rolange is both of them are grandmasters now. I think at the time the game was played, they're probably IMs. So this is the position which occurred on the board. Now, you can see that white is the king on the queen side, and I like what black did here. Black drops the queen back to b6 in order to open up the gates for the pawn, and then black sends the pawn down the board, a5. White goes d3, chasing the knight away. Black says, no problem. And here's the instructive moment. White plays a3. And what did black do in this position? And if you've been paying attention, you should be able to, you basically already know what black did. Now, white thinks that he's stopping a4. That's what white thinks. But he's not. No, guys, knight takes b3 is not the move. It's too early to sack on b3. The problem is, you sack on b3, and what do I always say? Don't be fooled into thinking that just because you have a queen in the attack, that means the attack is working. White can just go queen e2 and then queen c2. The move is a4, as I showed. b4, knight a6. It's literally 1-to-1, the same idea. Now, black doesn't sack on b4 immediately, but he does in a couple of moves. So what should black do first in order to soften up the b4 pawn? First, you got to soften up that pawn a little bit and open up the queen side further with the move c5. And white plays c3, and here we go. Takes, boom. And after queen b4, king e2, the point of the sacrifice actually isn't even made. What is the point of the sacrifice? What does black gain in return for the sacrifice? And black wins the game in 2 more moves. So think about it. Look at the queen side. What have we gained? We gained 2 passers. Black pushes a3. Knight d2, knight b5, and white simply resigned here. Because the knight is, and it's not even premature. I mean, the knight may be a little bit premature, but the knight's coming into c3. And the queen's coming to b2, and the pawn's coming to a2. This is completely lost. White's whole queen side is gone, and there's no way to coordinate the pieces sufficiently. So here you see a strong I am defeated by this idea. And I can show you more, but I think you get the point. So most of the ideas that I show are, you can find parallels in real games. And here you can do the exact same thing. You can go knight a6 and then c5. So anyways, after white plays d4, the game is basically over. We go knight e6, knight f4, and this is total devastation. Total devastation. It was like 22 moves. Now, obviously, white should take on d3 and then go king f1. Because if white goes king d1 here, we can still go bishop g4. But then we play knight takes b2. The knight is easily evacuated via d3 or defended via bishop e5. So the knight is unassailable here. This is really, really bad for white. Obviously, what white should have gone for is something like this, and the game goes on, but it's lost. I still don't get bishop g4. So I assume you mean you don't get why bishop g4 is good. Well, it's because this creates a pin against the knight and threatens e4. I assume you're familiar with the concept of a pin. And this pin is very good because it's an actionable pin. You can actually intensify the pressure on the knight. Oh, bishop g4 in the end. Well, it's a deflection sacrifice. This is the pin. So if white doesn't do anything, you take the queen. If white takes the bishop, then you take on f2, and this is a fork. This is a classic concept. Does that make sense? So this is now you might say, well, why couldn't we take on f2 immediately? Well, because the queen defends that square. You have to get the queen onto a forkable square using a pin. So both the pin and the fork play a role in this combination. Okay, great. All right, fantastic. I think that was a good, instructive game. Why can't white take the knight with a pawn? Well, because the queen is hanging. And I explained, I mean, of course, white should take here, but then we recapture with a fork. All right, let's make it to 1700. Let's make it to 1700.